As part of our 2A history project, here is a blast from the past.
There we go. Chairman Blumenthal, Sub-Ranking Member Lee, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Hlebinsky, and I am honored to testify today about the long history of privately made firearms in American culture. But first, I do want to address the terminology that I will be using and why. Firstly, I will not be using the term ghost gun, and that's because as a historian, I try to be as precise as possible, and the term is used more as a rhetorical tool, a marketing tool, and because of that, it can create a false sense of authority on the subject rather than describe the actual technology that we are talking about. For example, it is conceivable that when hearing the term, the average person could conflate the terms undetectable and untraceable. What I mean by that is, if you hear the term ghost gun, you could assume that it is invisible, and by that term, maybe it bypasses a security scanner. Instead, this term recognizes and references a lack of tracing tools that are sometimes used by law enforcement after a crime is committed. So for clarity, I will be using the terms such as home-built and privately made firearms. Please note, though, that I am using the term firearm as a historical definition rather than a legal one. Now let's shift to the historical background on these firearms. Now, trust me, there's a lot of history here, so please refer to my written testimony if you would like more specifics, and I'm happy to go into these details further if and when there is more time. But essentially, the big takeaway about the history is that these privately made firearms have been around for centuries, basically since the first ignition system was developed over 500 years ago. And throughout these times, these gun makers have been essential to both the civilian and government. It may surprise you that the term discussed a lot today, parts kits, have been used regularly dating back to the 1700s. Private gun makers in America could order locks and barrels from overseas in order to expedite the process when building guns. It's also important to note that these too involved filing processes and a lot of other modifications, as some parts kits are today. The other thing is, when armories became available, or people that were making government firearms, the individual and the private gun maker was still incredibly important. In the American Revolution, the British had an armory and they still bought lock plates from civilians. And the US government actually sought to design a standard pattern to simplify this process for individual gun makers. Even as modern manufacturing processes and major companies appeared in the 19th century, the government and commercial markets still relied on individual designers to innovate and create firearms that these companies would in turn purchase and produce. And as already said, these were mainly any firearm that you could do. And they were unencumbered by these regulations and laws that we're discussing today because they weren't considered a threat to public safety. And in this way, these regulations, is what we're talking about today, could influence innovation. And now, I know a lot of people here don't necessarily like some of the technology that exists today, but I really want to make the point that innovation also means making firearms safer. On May 7th, the ATF released a proposal in which they recommended several modifications to these definitions. Unfortunately, many of those rationales are not historically accurate. For example, the terms striker fire and split receivers are two technologies that were claimed not to be readily available at the time these definitions were made. However, striker fire guns, which are historically and mechanically known as linear hammers, have been prevalent, as have the term split receiver, since the late 1800s and early 1900s. These things have remained unregulated within the terms that we're talking about today. So the question is, why change that? Striker fire and split receivers do not make a firearm more or less lethal than the firearms that are available on the market today. Because this terminology is flawed and inaccurate, this is misleading. And these policies and proposed changes can have unintended consequences for everyone. And it's interesting and important to understand that these things can affect both sides, criminalizing those who would otherwise be considered innocent, but also opening the door for loopholes and litigation and worst of all, continued violence. The complicated and confusing nature of all of these terms also neuter the potential efficacy of the laws. And if the goal is to save lives and the law fails to accomplish what you claim it will, you're not only letting your constituency down, but you're also leaving them vulnerable to a false sense of security, something nobody here wants on either side.
Thank you. Commissioner Michael Harrison joining us remotely.
So let us know what you think. We'll be watching the comments wherever you find the video, over on gunstreamer.com or on guntube.org.
Thank you for supporting our projects. If you'd like to buy us a cup of coffee, check out our Patreon channel.
The guys and gals of gunwebsites.com encourage you to take a CCW class every year, practice at least once a month, and carry every day. Thank you for watching gunwebsites.com.